Testament. We are going to be looking at the book of Leviticus in a bit more detail right now. We're going to take a look at the Yom Kippur ritual, or the Day of Atonement, and then we're going to look at a few different types of rituals that we can see happen and ask questions about the priests. Who in the world are these people, and what are they doing in the Bible? So let's start with Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. Yom means day in Hebrew, and Kippur means covering over something, which ends up meaning kind of atoning for it, cleaning up a mess in another way of thinking about it. So the book of Leviticus, if you open up to it, you can follow with me in the kind of midpoint of the book of Leviticus. In chapter 16, we have this Day of Atonement ritual. So we'll walk through this fairly briefly, but I just want to point out a few things here. So God says to Moses, this is kind of the procedure for that day. In verse 2, tell your brother Aaron not to come just at any time into the sanctuary inside the curtain before the mercy seat that is upon the ark, or he will die. For I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. So this is God's special room, or the Holy of Holies, God's bedroom, the most holy of holy places. So don't go behind the curtain into the bedroom of God at any time, because this is dangerous. It's dangerous not because God is angry or mad or wrathful at Aaron, but because God is holy, right? Maintaining and preserving the distinction between a holy God and a world that is of differing levels of holiness, but isn't holy like God, is important for priestly, the symbolic world of these ancient priests. So this is how Aaron, in verse 3, is supposed to come into the holy place with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. So here we see that sin or purification offerings, what we see in chapters 4 and 5 of Leviticus, is different than a burnt offering, which is what is talked about in chapter 1 of Leviticus. So there's different kinds of offerings that are being brought here. And then verse 4, he, that is the high priest, symbolized by Aaron, shall put on the holy linen tunic and shall have linen undergarments next to his body, fasten the linen sash and wear the turban. So you got to wear holy stuff, the holy gear. Think about a hazmat suit for someone working in a nuclear facility. He shall bathe his body in water. So this is the purification ritual that needs to happen, just like someone needs to get bathed in water if they come out of a nuclear facility to get the radiation off of them. He shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. That is for a purification offering, those 2 male goats. Aaron shall offer the bull himself to make atonement for himself and for his house. He's an important person in this culture, so he needs to offer a bigger animal, a bull, whereas a regular person, a common person like me, would just take with them a little goat. So Aaron then shall take those 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and he shall cast 2 lots on the goats, one for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. So this is the scapegoating idea here. Now pay attention, because it happens a little bit differently than people imagine it, I think. This ritual here is to, in a way, appease Azazel, who, it seems very clear to me, kind of comes from some kind of previous understanding of a demon, a negative God who's trying to attack Yahweh and the people or something like this. But by the time it comes into the book of Leviticus, it's been changed. So this name Azazel is still a part of this ritual, but the book of Leviticus is very keen to not have us ask questions about Azazel. If they wanted us to know more about Azazel, they would tell us about Azazel, or that name would show up somewhere else in the Bible if the details about it were very important. But we just had these little clues about this thing and what it is. But nonetheless, so they throw lots for it. The high priest throws a lot, which means a dice. They made dice with the knuckle bones of animals. So they would roll the dice and they would pop up. One would say Azazel and one would say Yahweh. Somehow, and then they would assign the goats, right? And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for Yahweh and offer it as a sin offering, a purification offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, or Yahweh, and then it may be sent away into the wilderness for Azazel. So there's these 2, right? And the one, the sin offering goat actually has to be pure. The one that has the sins kind of put on it and kind of bears them away, carries them away. That's the one that goes into the wilderness there. So the goat that lives is actually the one that is this kind of sinful goat or something, the goat that bears away the sins of the people in some way. And the other goat, the goat that's perfectly fine and didn't do anything wrong, that isn't associated with sin or isn't carrying the people's sin, it has the pure blood, which then is going to be used to clean the people's sin off of the altar. So, this is maybe causes us to think a little bit about the mechanics of sacrifice, but the theology of it too, especially how it's approached in the New Testament. If you take that with you into the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it might help you make some sense of what the author is saying in that book. The other thing too is to know that this ritual here in the Yom Kippur happens one day a year, and it's the sacrifice that happens. And we haven't even got there yet. We're kind of getting inside. But this is when the high priest, and only the high priest, goes all the way into the most sacred of spaces, God's bedroom, the Holy of Holies, and offers the sacrifice on the altar to atone for the worst kinds of sins, for people who don't care to even repent of their sins. If there are sins that someone has committed that aren't confessed and repented for. By the way, these are kind of different things. I should spell this out really clearly. Sorry. Confession and repentance are different things than atonement, and that's different from forgiveness. So the first step has to be the person repenting or saying, I'm sorry, and trying to fix it. Real material kind of approach to reconciliation here. The person who has done the wrong needs to admit it, confess it, try to fix it as much as they can, maybe try to fix themselves as much as they can, right? Try to make sure they won't do this again. And then that person can seek forgiveness. And you do that not to God, but you do that from, according to these rituals, you do that from the person that you have wronged. And that person can offer forgiveness, or maybe they're not in a place to do that right now, but they don't absolutely have to right now. The idea is that over time they'll be able to join you in a reconciliation feast, but it has to work on their timetable. And then the third part of this is the atonement, and that's how you repair your relationship with God. So just notice those three parts are different, and I think there's some wisdom in how those work. Okay, so in this day of rituals, this whole day of rituals, the people are supposed to confess all the sins they possibly can and repent as much as they possibly can so that they can convert those sins to sins that can be handled by the priest and the priest's sacrifice. If there are people who have kind of certain kinds of really terrible sins like homicide, that are difficult to imagine forgiving, there's only one event that can happen that can take away the worst of those sins, and that is the death of the high priest. It's in the book of Numbers, right after the bit about sanctuary cities, which are in the Bible, by the way. Sanctuary cities, it's an important tip, the information that you should maybe know. But in any event, I don't have time to spend on that right now. But in this ritual, the high priest is kind of giving one goat to Yahweh and sacrificing this goat to clean off the sins of the people, and the other goat that's being kind of sent away into the wilderness, the scapegoat, is actually the one that doesn't die, at least until in this ritual, whatever Azazel does, whatever Azazel is and whatever Azazel does with this goat is left unsaid. So then verse 11, Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and his house. He's going to cook, right, with the coals, right? He's going to cook this meal. And he'll then take 2 handfuls of sweet incense and bring it inside the curtain and put the incense on the fire before the Lord. And the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat. So there's this incense altar, and you're supposed to get this cloud of smoke going so that the high priest doesn't die by witnessing the glory of God too closely. And this he will die, right? It's mentioned again there in verse 13. If the priest doesn't take these precautions, then he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger in front of the mercy seat. Remember, the mercy seat is on the Ark of the Covenant. It's the big kind of chair, the throne. So that's what the presence of God is imagined there. So the priest is going to try to atone for the people's sin and scrub the Ark of the Covenant itself to see if it can be cleaned with the power of blood. And then he shall slaughter the goat of the sin offering or the purification offering that is for the people. So the priest has to atone for the priest's own sins and the priest's family's sins. And then There's and by the way, this idea that you should atone, or you're going to be kind of judged with your family or your nation, it's kind of collective guilt and collective sin. It can be taken too far, and there's a lot of bad things that can be done with the idea of collective guilt and collective sin. Right? I can be blamed for a lot of things that I didn't do, etc. But maybe they know something that they're talking about, these ancient folk, in the same way that generational sin or the effects of generational sin can be felt by communities for quite a long time. You can think of this individually. I mean, the sins of the parents may be revisited upon the children, it says several times in the Bible, which sounds cruel, unless you think, well, in a family that deals with addiction behavior or alcoholism or abuse, the sins of the parents are definitely felt by the children and felt by the children's children. And addressing the sin is really the only way to fix this problem. It's going to keep repeating itself. You can make the same argument for like national level issues like reparations. The sin of the enslavement of millions of people is not something that goes away without addressing it as a people, ritually, I think, and also materially. So these you can sort of think of some of these kind of reparations or this rebuilding that needs to be taken place, or you can think of it in these ritual terms, and I think there's more than a bit of wisdom there. So the individual priest needs to atone for his own sin and his family's sin, and then there's the kind of national sin, the people's sin, right? Everyone, and there's this second sacrifice in verse 15 for that, and then thus he shall make, verse 16, thus he shall make atonement, the high priest, make atonement for the sanctuary, the space of God's dwelling, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, because of their transgressions, all their sins. So their uncleanness, right, their ritual and moral impurities, right, and then their transgressions, the ways that they've broken God's commandments, and then all their sins, like all that stuff. It's kind of summing everything up, right? Which remains with them in the midst of their, and so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which remains with them in the midst of their uncleanness. So this idea is that God's going to stick with you in the midst of all of your problems, your moral problems, your ethical problems, the problems of our culture, and so on. There is a limit to God's forbearance, as we shall see, but God has a high tolerance threshold for sin. And then no one shall be, verse 17, no one shall be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make the atonement in the sanctuary till the time he comes out. So stay out, right? If something very powerful is happening during this time, so everyone's got to back away. And then verse 18, you should go out to the altar that's before the Lord and make atonement in its behalf, and so on. So he's doing this kind of massive cleaning procedure, ritual cleaning procedure. And verse 18, he shall sprinkle some of it on the blood on it from his finger 7 times and cleanse it and hallow it from the uncleannesses of all the people of Israel. And then when he's finished doing all that stuff, he shall present the live goat. And then Aaron, verse 21, Aaron, remember that goat that got turned up for Azazel, right? The one that hasn't been killed. The one that was killed has to be completely pure. Then verse 21, Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting it on the head of the goat and sending it in the way into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. This is handling the sins in a slightly different way, not the ritual cleansing, but kind of bearing them away. It's kind of a second backup plan for handling sin in case the first didn't work. Notice, though, that the goat that bears away the sins is not killed, and it can't be. I mean, it can be killed, but it's not part of the ritual to kill it, because then its blood wouldn't be pure, wouldn't be effective. So just think about this in terms of, if you're thinking about this for kind of New Testament theology and the cross, this is hugely effective and important for the New Testament, but sometimes not in the way Christians think. So then the goat bears by itself the iniquities, verse 22, into a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. And then Aaron comes in, and he takes off this kind of, now his clothes are dirty, he's kind of gotten them radioactive, covered in radioactive unclean goo, and he shall bathe his water. He's got to kind of get this stuff out of it, right? And then he's going to cook some of the food. And then verse 27, the bull of the sin offering, the goat of the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall be taken outside the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall be consumed in fire. You're going to get kind of burn all this stuff out, get rid of all of the rest of it. And then the one who burns shall wash his clothes and bathe his body afterwards. It's kind of like a procedure, like the person who even handles the stuff that was left over, like the radioactive waste. The person who handles the radioactive waste has to themselves be purified afterwards. The person who did the act is, of course, needs to be kind of cleansed, deactivated. And then verse 29, this shall be a statute to you forever. In the 7th month, this 10th day of the month, you shall deny yourselves, you shall do no work, neither the citizen nor the alien who resides among you. The idea of rest is really important for these days. For on this day of atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you from all your sins. You shall be clean before the Lord. It is a Sabbath of complete rest to you. You shall deny yourselves. It is a statute forever. The priest who is anointed and consecrated, and so on. The idea is that the people are not in the sanctuary with the priest, but that the people are kind of surrounding this as well. So all the people are a part of this ritual, which is something important we'll see in a little bit. So that's kind of the idea, right, of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It also sits at the middle point of this of the book of Leviticus. I think it's there's a reason for it. But in the context of ancient Eastern ritual, hopefully this makes more sense now why all this stuff is happening. So let me move on just a little bit. I'll just give you an overview of some of the different kinds of rituals that we see in ancient Israel besides the Day of Atonement. We've talked about purification rituals and Day of Atonement, but there's a lot of other things we could talk about too. So foundation rituals. Foundation rituals are super important. These are rituals that mark the beginning of something. So I'm going to have a couple of different categories of rituals. The first tier, these foundation ones, it's like when you build a new building, right? So when Solomon builds the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, they have a huge ceremony where Solomon's going to slaughter a bunch of bulls and burn them up and offer them as sin offerings for the people and so on, but also well-being offerings and celebration offerings. When you make a new temple, there's lots of rituals that accompany starting the space and sanctifying it, purifying it, and then turning it into a space for God to live. In the same way that when a congregation moves into a church building, a new church building, there'll probably be some rituals to mark that transformation of space into holy space. Foundation rituals also make sense for people, right? The creation of the priesthood. Leviticus chapter 8 through 10 is all about the kind of foundation rituals that go along with the priests. What's funny here is that Moses is not ordained a priest. He's never ordained, right? He's not anything really. We'll get to what Moses is when we talk about Deuteronomy. But it's a very interesting issue. So the person who kind of stands outside of the priesthood is the one who inaugurates it. Moses does all the rituals to make Aaron the priestly family. And by the way, Aaron is the priestly family in Leviticus chapter 8. Aaron is a Levite, but not all Levites get to be priests. We'll get to that again in a minute. So these rituals, a foundation of like the ordination of a priest, the foundation of a space, something that being brought into the temple for the first time, a newly made menorah or something like that. The time when the Ark of the Covenant comes into the temple for the first time, there has to be a huge procession, as we see in 1 Kings 8. So all these things mark kind of the beginning of something, and I think these are important. It's important to notice that they really take the time to celebrate and also to properly prepare for new things in their rituals, in ritual life. The second category of rituals that I want to point out right now is life cycle rituals. These are rituals that happen when someone is born, when someone dies, to mark someone's kind of maturity in a way. So you can see this, it's about taking care of human beings using ritual from birth to the grave, to mark those moments in people's lives that are important. So birthing requires rituals, both rituals for the mother and for the child. There's a post-birthing ritual for male children, that's circumcision, which is hugely important for the priestly source as a mark on the skin of at least the male infants, in order to mark them as being part of God's family, but also to symbolically remind them that they are not the source of ultimate power and fertility and the future of the community and so on. We can also say that there are rituals for burying human bodies. We don't get a whole lot of detail about this, but we know it was important, and we can find ancient Israelite tombs where the bodies have been prepared carefully and taken care of, and so on. We can read a little bit about this in Leviticus 12, this kind of life cycle rituals there. We can also say that there are calendrical rituals. This is that Gezer calendar I showed you earlier, but rituals that have to do with a certain time of the year based on the calendar. One set of these, there's a few different sets, and they don't all agree, actually, which has caused some consternation in the history of Jewish interpretation and practice. But one set of these is Numbers chapter 28 and 29, where you can see these calendrical rituals lined out. Some daily sacrifices have to happen, morning and evening and so on. There are some weekly ones on the Sabbath that have to happen. There's monthly ones on the new moon that have to happen. There are sacrifices at the first of the year, which is measured differently in ancient culture than it is in modern culture. So Yom Kippur is the modern day. That's the first day of the year, and it seems to be kind of unimportant in terms of ancient Israelite tradition, but they had a different way to mark the beginning of the year. But in any event, you can compare this as well to Exodus 23, verses 14 through 17, where you can see this a little bit of a list of some of the days. Exodus 34 has a little bit as well in that kind of alternative 10 commandments that we see there. But in any event, you can also see these rituals that are made to accompany the agricultural lifestyle. The big ones, like when you can see kind of according to different crops that they have. So when the wheat comes in, the wheat crop comes in, you get the feast of matzot, which is unleavened bread. Later, this is associated with Passover. I say later, I know that they're both given in Exodus 12 at the same time, but they seem like two different festivals. Unleavened bread. This is something that you do at the end of the year. You kind of cook the remains of the grains that had been left behind in the grain pit since last year. Not great ones. But then it's kind of a final bit to get the old wheat out before you put the new wheat in. But then the festival of the Passover has to do with a lamb and leaving Egypt. They just seem like if you're an historian, you might wonder if these came from different sources. But in any event, that's associated with the time of the wheat harvest. Then there's the barley harvest, which comes later, and that's the festival of Shavuot, or weeks. It comes a certain number of weeks after the Passover feast. But then this is the feast that's also known by the name Pentecost, which later is associated with the kind of giving of the Torah and the law, and obviously for the New Testament community, this ends up referring to the giving of the Holy Spirit to the early church. But just to say at first, this is the barley harvest festival. This is why Ruth, the book of Ruth, is read in the Jewish community on the feast of Shavuot or Pentecost, because it depicts the threshing floor incident in Ruth in chapter 3, that's during the barley harvest. So it happens during that time. And then the grapes and olives come in, and that is associated with the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. Sukkot means a booth. A booth really, like a booth, it's like a lean-to structure, like a shed that you'd build in the middle of your agricultural land to get some shade in the middle of the day. Today, this festival is celebrated in Jewish communities by building little structures outdoors where Jewish families will hang out for a week and party and enjoy themselves. This is associated with the book of Ecclesiastes. So in any event, this type of ritual, this calendrical ritual, you have daily cycles and so on, but you have these yearly festival cycles as well. Yom Kippur, obviously, is one that happens, this Day of Atonement. Today, that falls close to the Jewish New Year. In ancient Israel, they didn't really celebrate this day, the day of Rosh Hashanah, but it is now celebrated. That came about just after the time of Jesus. And Rosh means head, and Hashanah means the year, so the head of the year or the top of the year, the first of the year. So that happens usually around September, according to the calendar that's used in the United States today, the Gregorian calendar. In any event, there are also contingent rituals that happen not according to the calendar, and also don't happen with any particular founding moment, but they happen when you need them to happen. So these are things like if you are sick and you are suffering and you want to get well, there are kinds of rituals that you can make, kind of asking God for something. The lament psalms in the Bible, some of them mention sacrifices, so you might bring something to the temple when you pray for healing or wholeness. Then when you get healed or are whole or something like this, then when your prayers are answered, if they are, then you would come bearing a different kind of sacrifice, a sacrifice of well-being. Like happy sacrifices, and this is you can find this in Leviticus as well. This is a type of sacrifice that you'd bring to kind of have a celebration. You'd want to celebrate with God and with the priests and so on, let them know that everything's great, and kind of let them share in the blessings of your life. So that is one kind of offering that you can see, the contingent rituals. And also the purification or sin offering, right? When you mess up, you got to do it, and it doesn't matter when it is. You don't just sin near Yom Kippur. So whenever you do that, whenever you mess up, you need to fix it using a ritual, and that whatever day you can do it, you do it. So you can even see that Leviticus chapters 1 through 7 are built to teach you about these different kinds of offerings. The whole burnt offering, the big bowl that the priest offers for all the people. That's chapter 1 of Leviticus. Chapter 2 is a cereal or grain sacrifice, and this might have happened for different reasons, but this might have been something that you would bring when you were kind of asking to get well, to get better. And then the next chapter 3 of Leviticus, is the peace and well-being offering, your Thanksgiving offerings when your things have gone well for you. Then next you have the purification and guilt reparation offerings in chapters 4 and 5 of Leviticus, which we read a little bit of in the previous video. So these rituals are meant to kind of mark the seasons of your life, help you to move through the seasons of your life, help you to lament when you need to lament, help you to praise when you need to praise, help you to be grateful when you need to be grateful, but also to help people reintegrate into the community at moments of breakage. So it might behoove us to think about how we do this kind of work in our own communities and what kind of principles we use to do this work. So who are these priests? Who are these holy people that we keep talking about? There's a few really interesting things here. I don't have enough time to kind of lay out all of the information about priests that might be helpful for you, but I got an overview here. To be a priest in ancient Israel, there's some basic things you need to be, and that is it's a patriarchal system. It's a system that is built around, we could say androcentric, andro meaning man, centric meaning kind of structured around. So this idea that it's built around families of that are associated with particular men. So you have to be a man to be a priest in ancient Israel. You have to be pure, that is, as ritually pure as possible. Part of being pure was that one should not have physical defects according to the standards of the day. So you can see this concern in Leviticus. This is one thing that makes my skin crawl a little bit because what are defects, right? According to whose standard? If I lived in ancient Israel and I was from a priestly family, I wouldn't be allowed to be a priest because I have what they would have thought was a physical defect. I wouldn't have been tam or pure, meaning whole and without any defects, because I would have had the defect of my eyesight, among other things that would have counted me as being disabled in ancient Israel. Disabilities are culturally constructed in the sense that how we interpret human differences, whether or not, what is normal is a construction from different communities at different times, just like the glasses show you, right? In the United States today, I'm normal for having glasses, in fact, but in the ancient world, I would have been considered disabled. So according to the standards of abilities that were considered normal during the time of ancient Israel, you had to fit those standards in order to be considered to be a priest. The idea comes from the idea of sacrifices, that there's a concern that people would want to give animals that were not considered to be worth as much money perhaps because of what were considered physical defects in these animals, sickness, and some things like this. So you couldn't give those kinds of animals as gifts to God, right, or to the priest as reconciliation feast. That wouldn't necessarily show your contrition. So the idea is that you were supposed to give of the best of your flocks, and this logic seems to have worked backward into the idea of the priesthood. Which has some troubling effects, I think. We need to think twice about the kinds of standards of physicality that we assume people should have to be ordained or to be set aside for God's special use in the world. So, in any event, priests also had to be from a particular family or families, and we'll get to what those are in just a moment. So, what did these priests do? Well, I got news for you. They did a lot. Some people think these ancient priests sat around all day or something, and no, they did a whole lot of stuff. One thing that they had to do was they had to give oracles. An oracle means a message from God. They had to give messages from God sometimes. They did this differently than the prophets, whose job it was to give oracles, that is, to give messages from God to the peoples and the king and so on. The priest's oracles generally were about whether or not someone had done something well, but sometimes they had to be consulted even for decisions about matters of state. Sometimes David goes to the priest in the book of Samuel. David will go to the priest and say, hey, am I supposed to go attack today or not? And the priest is supposed to kind of figure out from God, is this the right day? Sometimes the priest has to give individuals oracles about whether or not they're going to be able to have children, or whether or not they should partake a certain undertaking, if they should start something. They're supposed to kind of let people know sometimes about ethics even. So in Numbers chapter 27, the priests play a role in trying to mediate and negotiate a peace in the community that has to do with differing conceptions of justice. So all to say, the priests are supposed to do that kind of stuff, to be the mouthpiece for God in a way. They're also supposed to teach people in their own words. So they're supposed to be good teachers. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 10 to 11 says, they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the unclean and the clean. Notice those are our categories that I've structured this around, so I have lived up to Leviticus chapter 10, verses 10 to 11 in my teaching. Thank you very much. So, in any event, the idea is that the priests have to tell people this stuff. People aren't just going to know it. That's why Leviticus exists as a manual to try to help the priests help people learn all of this stuff. And then Ezekiel chapter 44 quotes this, in fact. Ezekiel's associated with a priestly family, may even be a priest himself, but talks about this fact that priests need to teach people things. There weren't ancient schools, right? So people like priests had to teach them things. But then also, Deuteronomy chapter 33 verse 10 says, they teach Jacob your ordinances and Israel your law, and they put incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. Obviously, this is about priests who do the sacrifice work, but in any event, this is one thing they have to do. They also have to render judgments. They have to actually make decisions for the community sometimes, economic, social decisions, and so on. Ezekiel 44:24 says, in controversy they, the priests, shall act as judges, and they shall decide it according to my judgments. They shall keep my laws and my statutes regarding my appointed festivals, and they shall keep my Sabbaths holy. They're also supposed to give blessings. Sometimes people want to know, is God on my side or not? Is God blessing me or not, right? So the priests have to be the ones that actually kind of mediate God's blessing, and sometimes mediate God's blessings in cases where people have been devastated, or when people are sick, when people need help. So this is what we would call today pastoral care. The priests are the ones who offer pastoral care to the people. These lament psalms that you see in the Bible, priests would have given these kind of psalms to people to say and helped them to read them and say them out loud in order to help them live through those moments of pain in their own lives. In Psalm 55, it's a lament psalm. This person's had a terrible time. By the end of the psalm, the very end seems to be spoken by the priest in verse 22. The priestly response that is given to a lament about a life that has fallen into quite some pain. Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 24, which we started the week with, right? The priestly blessing. That's a blessing that the priests even wore in amulets around their neck, and they're supposed to give this blessing to people. So this is a part of the pastoral care that they present to ancient Israel. Sorry, my face is covering this up a bit, but this is temple administration. So temple administration. They're supposed to do buildings and grounds work. In 2 Kings chapter 12, you can see a little story of the priests that have to rebuild part of the temple because it's fallen into disrepair, and they have to raise the funds for it and so on. So they're a bit like fundraisers and buildings and grounds people, and they have to sometimes contract with workers to help build the temple or rebuild it. They have to invest and distribute funds that the temple has access to. And lastly, they have to serve at the altar, minister. They're the only ones, the priests are the only ones that can touch the blood, that can clean the altars, that can actually cook the food at the altar, and so on. That's their job entirely. So let me just run this down again for you. They're supposed to help people know what God says. They're supposed to teach people. They're supposed to make community decisions and deal with kind of ethics and things like that. They're supposed to give pastoral care to people. They're supposed to work with buildings and grounds, and they're supposed to serve at the altar, which may involve kind of some speaking and preaching. I don't know if this sounds like a familiar job set to you, but this is in fact what the modern job of the pastor is based on. The idea for the pastorate comes from priests, and the job responsibilities actually are part and parcel of that. So let me move on to asking some questions about priestly families. Who in the world are these people? So we'll start with the Levites. You'd think that all Levites are priests because that's generally the way that Christians are taught about this, but that's actually not the case. I don't have time here to show this to you today, but just look through Numbers chapters 3 through 5, and you'll see a census, which it takes place at the beginning of Numbers, a census of the priestly families, where God and Moses are talking about these families of Levites. And they are clearly not priests, most of them. They are assistants to the priests, not assistant priests, assistants to the priest. They are not to touch the altar. They are not to touch the blood. They are not to get too near holy objects because they themselves are not holy. So just so you can see this, you take a look at Numbers chapters 3 through 5, and there's plenty of different indications of this. But there we can also see other voices about this Levitical family. The Levites seem to have been, like I said, assistants to the priest and mistreated sometimes. They were given access to the food that priests were given access to sometimes. In the book of Deuteronomy, they are treated like very poor laborers who are starving and need access to food badly and are being shut out of access to the food. So in the book of Numbers, it's the Aaronide priests. Aaron and Aaron's family are the priests. Now they come from the Levites, but they're a small group of Levites, and they are the ones that get to be priests. And the Levites are all the rest of those people who are kind of vaguely associated with Aaron, distant cousins, but they aren't allowed to be at the altar and to offer the sacrifices and to partake in them, which means that they don't get much. So Deuteronomy 18 is it tries to help people. There's some laws in there about Levites and how we're supposed to give them food. Give the Levites food. Don't you dare take away the Levites' food from them. They don't have access to land like other Israelites do, so they depend upon the offerings of the people. So priests don't take all the stuff and leave it from the Levites. Levites get a fair share of the portion that you are taking, right? It's kind of a critique of the priests in Deuteronomy 18. So take a look. So we can also see that the Levites at times are kind of banished from the temples. In 1 Kings 12, the northern kingdom begins its career of being separated from the southern kingdom of Judah. The king Jeroboam banishes the Levites from the temples and takes them away and installs other people that he likes more as priests. It's very possible that Hosea is a Levite who got kicked out of working for the temples and has been mad ever since. Okay, and then we can see also some conflict between some of the Levites and some of the Aaronides, or the family of Aaron. We can see this in Exodus 32. We can see this in Numbers 16 as well, so pay attention to that for scripture reading practicum. To be a priest, you have to be able to trace back your lineage to Levi, but more specifically to Aaron. So this is perhaps why the genealogies are so important throughout the priestly work. They have been wanting to document these genealogies forever. We can see in the book of Ezra that after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the exile, the people are coming back home, and some people say, I'm a priest, but I can't prove it from the genealogies, and they're not allowed to be priests. That's why the genealogies are so important for them. It's their card that lets them kind of enter in and get their, in work to be a priest. So these Levites later on, by the way, in the very end of the biblical period, they end up kind of getting jobs in the temple that are not priestly jobs, but they do other things. So the book of Chronicles tells us about how they ended up being basically the choir for the temple and the musicians for the temple. And the Levites got some other jobs as well, even songwriters in some cases. But those are kind of token jobs given to them because they never quite made it to the altar themselves. We can also see this at work in the Korah story. So pay attention in your scripture reading practicums to the use of Levite and the use of holiness in this story, or two stories, should I say. And then next, the Aaronide family. This is the family of Aaron, descendants of Aaron. So Nadab and Abihu, the guys who died in Leviticus 10, those were Aaron's sons. But he had other sons, which continued his legacy. And so the high priesthood has to be in this kind of line, or at least be able to trace their line to it in some way. This is a problem later on in history because Zadok, it had the high priest under David. He can't really trace his line to Aaron very well, but in any event, it's a really interesting thing in the Bible. Zadok has several different genealogies in the Bible that don't agree with each other, which suggests there was a big problem for Zadok. But in the Bible, in Numbers, it says the Aaronide priests, the sons of Aaron are the only ones that are allowed to come near the altar, that are allowed to serve. Other people will die, and it's like telling Levites that they will die if they try to serve at the altar. These folks seem to have been the central folks at to run the Jerusalem temple. That's why it's all, Leviticus is all about the sons of Aaron. Just check out chapter 8 of Leviticus for that. But these folks seem to have been in charge in other temples, perhaps even in the north some too. So it seems to have been an early, very powerful group of priests who kept their power. We also see evidence for a tribe of priests that call themselves the Mushites, or the Moses priests, the sons of Moses. They have been systematically written out of the Bible. They got into a fight somehow. That fight might be part of what the golden calf episode is about, Moses versus Aaron. But we can see mentions of this in Judges chapters 17 and 18, which is a crazy story of a guy who ends up being kind of called to be a priest by the wandering tribe of Dan, who doesn't have a home, which we'll get to again later, but the idea of the tribes and where they belong and so on. But there's a guy who's described as a Levite who gets ordained and becomes the priest for this wandering band of migrants. And then, first he starts with this guy named Micah, by the way. He's kind of a house priest for a guy who, the guy apparently ordains this Levite as well, by the way, which is really interesting. Well, Micah is definitely not a Levite. But then in chapter 18, it's that wandering tribe of Dan that steals this priest and brings him up. And then the story ends with just the strangest sort of thing you can imagine. Now, just follow me here real quick. Go to Judges. So it's right after Joshua. Joshua, Judges. So Judges chapter 18. Definitely take a look at Judges 17 and 18. It is wild. So at the end of Judges chapter 18. So this is this wandering priest who's been called a Levite, who was taken by this roving group of folks. And then verse 30, so chapter 18, verse 30, the Danites set up the idol for themselves. This is not good, by the way. This priest is a kind of a bad guy. And then Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the time they went into captivity. So they maintained as their own Micah's idol that he had made, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. There's a lot going on there, but did you notice that? It's Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests. So there's a whole group of Moses priests, people who trace their lineage back to Moses, who are the priests for the tribe of Dan for a long time, hundreds of years. Why don't we hear more about these people? I mean, Moses' family dies out according to like Exodus and Numbers, Deuteronomy. I mean, you don't hear about Moses' kids very much. They don't play a role in the founding of Israel in the book of Joshua. They're not even mentioned in Joshua. But then in Judges, you get this little thing where like, oh yeah, remember that guy Moses? I mean, he was a big deal, right? But he had these kids who like kind of ran a whole part of the country for a while. Isn't that crazy? Let's get back to the other story, right? It's almost like a hidden a family. This is why something might have happened to them. They ran afoul of the Aaronites or something. We don't know. We don't have enough information to know really what's going on with the Mushites. We can see other priestly families like the family of Eli and the Shilonites. You heard that at the very end of Judges 18:31. The house of God was at Shiloh. Shiloh is a fascinating place. It's the place that kept the Ark of the Covenant for some time. The priests from there are often mocked and derided, like Eli. They're also sometimes celebrated. The priests of Nob were associated with the Shiloh crew, and they cared for David and protected him, and David elevated them, and then he was the one to bring the Ark into Jerusalem when he made it his capital. So this is a group that also seems to have had some kind of struggles with power and acceptance and identity over their career. And we'll have mention of these priests. There's another guy, by the way, Abiathar, who ends up getting exiled by Solomon. He's got a great-great-great-grandson named Jeremiah, who really hates the temple. Might have something to do with the fact that his great-great-granddad should have been high priest and was high priest for a little while, and then was kicked out. And maybe Jeremiah thinks he should have been high priest. All to say that this is like any other human institution. The priesthood in ancient Israel was full of politics. It was full of, you can't get away from this stuff. It's a part of who we are as people. And we find this kind of jostling for power over time and prestige and privilege, even among the people who are supposed to be God's chosen ones and the ones the most holy in the community. This shouldn't disappoint us too much, I don't think. This is the way humanity is, and God loves us anyway. Remember that part about Yom Kippur? God is with us in the midst of our uncleannesses. Unless we think that we can get rid of all the bad people and make only the good ones priests or pastors. Augustine of Hippo, famous African theologian, he made the overwhelmingly victorious argument in a struggle with an early Christian community who wanted to get rid of anyone who'd done anything bad ever as priest. And Augustine said, no, the priests are not, like the priests are going to have problems because we're all people and we all have problems. Instead, you have to accept the fact that your priest has problems, and that God's sacramental love and God's sacramental power is able to work in the world regardless. So I've ever since learning about that, that's called the Donatist controversy. I'm guessing you're going to hear about that some in church history class. But ever since learning about that, it's helped me to deal with the idea that these priests, ancient priests and modern folk, are not always who we want them to be, and we are not always who we want ourselves to be. Thank goodness that God has given us ways to atone. We will meet this guy later on, Zadok, who becomes high priest. As I said, he's got a sketchy family genealogy, but ends up becoming co-high priest with Abiathar, that guy who gets exiled. Zadok wins out because he backs Solomon. So Zadok ends up becoming the high priest, sole high priest, and his family is high priests of the Jerusalem temple until right around the year 175 BC. So from 1000 BC to 175 BC, they are the high priests and the high priestly family. Obviously, the temple is destroyed for some years after the exile, during the exile, but this priesthood is able to kind of reassert their power and presence as they come back. So this is a pretty remarkable stretch of time that this family is able to be on top. We also have some other minor priestly families that we could mention too, but it seems to be a jumble of stuff. Last thing I'll mention about religion, I've already mentioned this at the very beginning, but just like other ancient Near Eastern communities and civilizations and cultures, the Israelites had several different layers of religion. Home religion, which would have looked different from the local kind of religious cult sites, your nearby town, and the kind of priests that would have been working in your local context, versus the central cult sites. What we've got in the Bible is all filtered through the lens of these folks who work at the Jerusalem temple. This is gonna change and filter the narrative a bit. So just know that what you're reading is written through the scribes working at these central cult sites that have a bias against the local sites, right? So to sum it up, Leviticus has got this kind of very particular structure, which I think actually helps us to take a look at. I'm going to shrink my head here as I finish this. Okay, so Leviticus chapters 1 through 16 are the priestly manual. Leviticus 1 through 7 is that manual of sacrifice with all those different kinds of sacrifice I mentioned before. And then we can see Leviticus 8 through 10 is all about the installation, the ordination of the high priesthood, the beginning of the cult, that is the ritual worship at the altar, and the Aaronide priesthood, the sons of Aaron. And their death, in fact, Nadab and Abihu. And then in Leviticus 11 through 15, we get all these laws they're supposed to teach the people about, and customs, and that's the manual of like how to be ritually pure. And this is really about ritual purity, not moral purity or impurity, right? As I tried to spell out earlier. Leviticus 16, that's the Day of Atonement, right? So notice that it's kind of separated from that manual of sacrifice. A lot of people think this was refined at a later date or something, because it's added seemingly at the end, really, of all this other material in Leviticus. And then we get this real big change. Leviticus chapter 7. So Leviticus 1 through 16 is written to priests to talk to people and to help them understand the rituals. But the priests are the ones that are holy. And it's not about ethics or morals exactly. It says don't do bad things, and here's what you do if you do bad things, but it kind of lets other institutions spell out what's good or bad. The priests aren't necessarily giving you a lot of detail about that. Like in Leviticus 5, it's like if you sin against someone, and it gives you some like ideas about that, if you cheat them out of money and stuff, but the laws are in a different part, right? But Leviticus chapter 17 through 26 is so different. It's so different that a lot of people suggest that this is a later book that's been edited into Leviticus that reflects a much later date. It's a priestly book. It's like the priests have changed, and maybe this is after the exile, right? The exile would mess a lot of things up with a theology that was based on kind of ritual sacrifice and so on, because there's no altar for a long time, right? When they're in exile, they can't do sacrifices. So it's possible that this holiness code is either written in exile or after it, when they've come back to the land, they've been changed thoroughly by that event. And the holiness code is different because, and I'll just kind of show you here, by the way, at the very end there's this little appendix with some instructional stuff that we don't know when this comes from. But that holiness code, Leviticus 17 through 26, has such a different idea of how the world works. In the priestly texts in P, like Leviticus 1 through 16, the sanctuary is holy. But for the holiness code, all the land is holy. It's a big difference in the holiness code. Just look at Leviticus chapter 17 and just start to read it. You'll see how different this approach is. You can also see the idea that holiness itself is different in the holiness code. In the priestly texts, holiness is static. It doesn't change much. If something is holy, it can sort of become impure, but it can't be like made unholy exactly. It can't be put back in the common world again. It'll just be defiled, and then it'll have to be restored, or it'll just be a holy thing that's been defiled. But in the holiness text, there's this wide-ranging idea. I mean, it's so different too. People can become holy, and not priests. So in the priestly source, it's just priests who are holy, and just one group, right? It's just the sons of Aaron that are holy. The Levites aren't even holy. You can see this in the number 16, the text for discussion this week. But this is an amazing thing. In the holiness code, everyone is supposed to be holy, and holiness can be like attained, and it can be lost. You can strive for holiness and work up to it. So we can see that there's this massive change that comes at quite a late date in the biblical period, where there's this shift to a very different way of thinking about holiness that connects to the New Testament and also connects to the way that a lot of Christians think about holiness today. So this is a transformation in the idea of holiness. So when we read stuff about ancient sacrifice, try to see the discussion of holiness a little bit apart from some of these later transformations. One of the keys of this class is that there isn't one thing the Bible says. The Bible says a lot of things, but also when the Bible says something or talks about an issue or a topic, that thing can change over time. So the concept of holiness changes over time, and that's okay because God is working with us where we are. But it's also maybe helpful for us to look back in the past sometimes and see some different constructions of concepts like holiness that might have lessons for us today too. So there's a lot more that I can say, but the Holiness Code also tells us this is the part of the Bible that tells us a lot about like the Jubilee, right? Setting people free and clearing debt. That everyone in the community has access to land every generation. Land meaning like the ability to produce things to sustain your life. We also hear stuff like in chapter 19, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus didn't make that up. That's in Leviticus 19. He was quoting it. Just a little bit later, verse 34 of chapter 19, love the alien as yourself, the foreigner, the wanderer, the refugee. There's all kinds of stuff too, like don't let your animals interbreed with like across lines, and I mean it's just like there's all sorts of there's like agricultural advice in this material. It's like all of human life is under God's purview here. We also have some language about sexuality and about sexual relations in chapter 19, especially that have been used for harm over. This is one of those what they call clobber texts that have been used to kind of hurt people over time. If you want to hear my take on Leviticus chapter 19 and what is often interpreted to be relevant to today, let me suggest I've posted my thoughts on this. There's a document that was posted for the conversation about Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. So I'll repost that here just so it's here again, but just take a look at that if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on Leviticus and sexuality. All right. We're done. This is an image, a beautiful image in Ghent, the Ghent altarpiece in Belgium, and it's a beautiful place, a beautiful image, but also it's just it is trying to show us this kind of liturgical ritual core to Christianity that draws explicitly from ancient Israelite sacrifice. And if you want to understand why Jesus is a lamb that has to be slain and why blood is important in our religion, we don't have to agree with all of the ways that these symbols are used, interpreted, the way that people are taught them, but just know that that's why they are there. Jesus' death and resurrection, I think, take on some new and interesting dimensions of meaning if we know about the priestly source. All right, we're done with our tour of the priestly world. There's a lot more that I could say, and I feel sorry leaving so much on the table, but we'll have to get back at it another time. And enjoy your weekend.